Chapter 16. Consequences of the War of Bar Kokhba. The Roman ruler Hadrian, who during the Great Uprising had lived in constant fear of rebellion, did not consider the suppression of resistance sufficient. He sought to remove every possibility of a future national revival among the Jewish population. For this purpose, he issued a series of imperial decrees designed not only to punish, but to dismantle the religious and cultural foundations of Judaism itself, targeting the spiritual continuity of the surviving communities. To enforce these measures, Hadrian appointed a Roman official named Turnus Rufus, also known in historical sources as Tinius Rufus, a governor in Judea. He was not known for battlefield command against organized armies, but rather for administering systematic pressure, surveillance, and legal enforcement against civilian populations. His role was to implement policies that weakened religious identity through continuous restrictions. After the Roman general Severus was reassigned to Britain following his military campaigns, Turnus Rufus carried out a symbolic act of domination in Jerusalem. He ordered a plow to be drawn over the ruins of the former city and the destroyed Temple Mount. This act, performed on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Ab, carried deep symbolic meaning, marking the complete reversal of the former sacred center. According to tradition, this event occurred approximately 1 year after the fall of the fortress of Bethar, the last stronghold of the revolt. Hadrian then initiated a reconstruction of Jerusalem on a different section of the site, shifting the city northward into what had once been suburban areas. The rebuilt settlement was populated with retired Roman soldiers, along with settlers from Phoenicia and Syria, forming a new colonial population loyal to Rome. The new city was named Ælia Capitolina, combining the emperor's family name with a dedication to Jupiter Capitolinus, the chief deity of Roman religion. It was constructed according to Greco-Roman urban planning, including 2 central marketplaces, a theater, and other civic institutions. The city was divided into 7 administrative districts to reflect Roman organizational structure. On the former Temple Mount, a column was erected in honor of Hadrian himself, alongside a temple dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus. Statues of Roman, Greek, and Phoenician deities were installed throughout the city, transforming the landscape into a fully pagan civic environment. In official documents, the name Jerusalem was replaced entirely by Ælia, to the extent that later generations had lost awareness of its original identity. Roman policy extended beyond urban transformation. At the southern gate leading toward Bethlehem, a relief depicting the head of a pig was installed as an intentional provocation against Jewish religious sensitivities. Entry into the outer boundaries of the city was forbidden to Jews under penalty of death. Religious restructuring was also imposed across the surrounding region. On Mount Gerizim, the sacred site of the Samaritan community, a temple dedicated to Jupiter was constructed. On Mount Golgotha, a location associated with Jerusalem's religious memory, a temple dedicated to Venus was established. In Bethlehem, a cave venerated by local tradition became the site of a statue honoring Adonis, a figure of Greco-Roman mythology. These measures reflected a broader imperial strategy, similar to that of earlier rulers such as Antiochus Epiphanes, who had previously attempted to suppress Jewish religious practice by force. The objective was not only political control, but cultural transformation through religious replacement. A legal decree was issued in Judea that imposed severe punishments on practices central to Jewish identity, including circumcision, observance of the Sabbath, and adherence to traditional law. Unlike earlier persecutors, Hadrian did not enforce compulsory worship of Roman gods in all cases. However, any visible expression of Jewish religious life was targeted. Even practices that were indirectly connected to tradition, including marriage customs and legal documents of divorce, were restricted or prohibited under additional interpretations enforced by local authorities. These years, extending from the aftermath of the fall of Bethar through the period following Hadrian's death, became known in Jewish historical memory as a time of religious persecution and legal suppression, in which survival itself required constant negotiation between law and necessity. During this period, no functioning central authority equivalent to the former Sanhedrin appears to have existed. In its absence, a group of surviving legal scholars and teachers gathered in a modest upper chamber in the town of Lydda, a center in the coastal region of Judea. Among those present were Akiba ben Joseph, Tarpon, and Joseph the Galilean. Ishmael ben Elisha, known for a more measured interpretive approach, was also associated with these discussions. A fundamental debate arose concerning how Jewish law should be observed under conditions of imperial prohibition. One position held that every commandment must be upheld even at the cost of death. Another position, represented by Ishmael, argued that the law was intended to preserve life, and therefore could be temporarily set aside under coercion in order to survive. The assembly ultimately adopted a structured compromise. A distinction was drawn between three absolute prohibitions: idolatry, prohibited sexual relations, and murder, and other commandments which could be suspended under threat of death. This decision reflected the extreme conditions of the time, in which legal continuity had to be balanced against survival under persecution. A further underlying principle, though not always openly stated, allowed for adaptation under duress while maintaining long-term fidelity to the law whenever conditions permitted. Many individuals continued to observe traditions in private while outwardly conforming to Roman enforcement measures to avoid detection by imperial authorities. Under the severe pressure of Roman rule during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, life for the Jewish population in Judea became a continuous struggle between survival and fidelity to religious law. Many individuals were forced into situations where they attempted to preserve their lives while still maintaining some form of religious conscience. This created a pattern of cautious behavior, subtle avoidance, and carefully constructed compromises designed to avoid direct confrontation with Roman decrees. The Roman authorities, acting through military officers and legal inspectors known as inquisitors or questioners, enforced imperial edicts with strict literal interpretation. Even minor acts of religious expression were treated as violations of law. One case records that a Roman inspector punished a man named Artabanus for affixing a mezuzah, a small inscribed parchment placed on doorposts as a sign of Jewish faith, to his home. The penalty imposed was a heavy financial fine of 1,000 denarii, a substantial sum of Roman currency. In another instance, a man named Elisha, possibly connected to earlier ascetic traditions, such as those associated with the Essenes, was executed by skull fracture for wearing tefillin, small leather boxes containing biblical passages worn during prayer. The enforcement of Roman policy extended even into everyday appearance and clothing. Wearing distinctively Jewish garments could itself become a source of danger. As a result, two students of Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah adopted local non-Jewish dress in order to avoid detection. When questioned about this decision, they responded that open resistance to imperial law would be equivalent to voluntary self-destruction, revealing the extreme tension between religious identity and survival under occupation. Rabbi Ishmael, a prominent teacher of the law during this period, described the situation as one in which persecution had become constant and unavoidable. He explained that Roman authorities had issued harsh decrees interfering with essential religious practices, including the prohibition of circumcision, the ritual sign of the covenant in Jewish tradition. Faced with this reality, he argued that in extreme circumstances, certain legal transgressions might be temporarily tolerated in order to ensure the continued existence of the Jewish people, since complete strictness could result in the disappearance of the community itself. However, not all individuals accepted such compromises. A significant number of Jews refused to rely on legal exceptions or protective interpretations. These individuals continued to observe religious commandments, even at the risk of immediate execution. A surviving description from this period illustrates the systematic nature of Roman punishment. It records that individuals were asked why they suffered different forms of execution, and their responses were directly connected to specific religious acts. One was beaten for using a lulav, the palm branch used during the Festival of Tabernacles. Another was executed for eating unleavened bread during the Festival of Passover. Others were condemned to death by fire or sword for teaching the Torah or circumcising their children. These accounts reflect a structured system of punishment linked to identifiable religious behavior. Roman judicial methods of execution during this period were described in extremely harsh terms. Various forms of physical punishment were employed, including the placement of heated metal objects under the armpits, the insertion of sharp instruments beneath fingernails, the application of damp wool to prolong suffering during burning, and the removal of skin. These descriptions illustrate the severity of imperial enforcement rather than isolated incidents. Despite strict surveillance by Roman officials, enforcement alone was not sufficient. A significant role was played by informers and collaborators within the Jewish population. Some of these individuals acted out of personal gain, others in an attempt to gain favor with Roman authorities, and some, including certain Jewish Christians, reportedly sought to distinguish themselves from mainstream Jewish society. Among those associated with such activity is a figure known as Acher, a name meaning the other, given to Elisha ben Abuya after his departure from traditional Jewish belief. He is described as having assisted Roman authorities by identifying religious practices and distinguishing between essential and non-essential observances, thereby enabling more effective enforcement. Roman authorities under Emperor Hadrian or his administrators placed particular emphasis on two central institutions of Jewish continuity: the study of religious law in schools and the formal ordination of students into recognized teachers. These institutions ensured the transmission of religious tradition from one generation to the next. As a result, severe punishments were imposed on teachers who maintained schools and on those who conferred ordination. Entire communities were held collectively responsible for such activities, and in some cases towns and surrounding areas faced destruction if ordinations were conducted within them. This strategy aimed to interrupt the transmission of religious authority itself. Within this context, Rabbi Jose ben Kizma represented a contrasting voice. Known for his moderate and cautious approach, he advocated submission to Roman authority as a means of survival. He believed that resistance would bring unnecessary destruction and that endurance under imperial rule was preferable to open confrontation. On one occasion, he encountered Rabbi Chanina ben Turin, who belonged to the opposing group that encouraged continued teaching of the law despite danger. Rabbi Chanina was found teaching students from a Torah scroll placed upon his lap. Rabbi Jose warned him that Roman authority appeared firmly established, pointing to the destruction of the temple and the continued power of the empire despite the suffering of the righteous. He cautioned that continued defiance of imperial law would likely lead to execution, even for sacred texts themselves. Rabbi Jose ben Kizma was regarded with favor by Roman officials in the province of Judea. After his death, he was honored by individuals of high social and political standing, reflecting his reputation as a figure who had maintained a position of cautious cooperation with the ruling power during a period of intense religious and political tension. The teachers of the law, known as the Tannahites, meaning transmitters of the traditional teachings of Judaism, held a very different position from those who advised caution and submission. Many among them resolved that they would rather accept death than abandon their assemblies in the study houses. In their understanding, the continuous study of the law, meaning the sacred teachings attributed to Moses and preserved in oral tradition, was of greater importance than the performance of ritual commandments alone. A decisive ruling was made in the upper chamber of a building in the city of Lod. There it was declared that teaching the law to others was even more essential than merely performing its commandments. While some teachers had temporarily accepted restrictions imposed by the ruling authorities, they now emphasized something more absolute: the preservation of knowledge itself, even at the cost of life. In their view, safeguarding the continuity of Jewish tradition outweighed all other considerations, and this conviction pushed them toward martyrdom as the highest expression of faithfulness. An ancient tradition speaks of 10 scholars who were executed for the sake of the law, often referred to as the 10 martyrs. However, only 7 names have been reliably preserved, while the remaining accounts are uncertain or incomplete. The first among them was Ishmael ben Elisha, the son of the high priest Elisha, a prominent religious figure. He was known for formulating the 13 interpretive rules used in explaining the sacred texts. Alongside him was a man named Simon, a name shared by many individuals of that period. Ishmael, unlike those who advised others to avoid danger, refused to instruct others to seek martyrdom, yet he accepted his own fate with willingness and dignity. Another leading teacher, Akiva ben Yosef, later reflected on the deaths of Ishmael and Simon. He described them as righteous individuals who had been executed unjustly, and he urged his own students to prepare themselves for the possibility of death, warning them that severe times were approaching. His words revealed the growing pressure on the religious leadership and the increasing danger surrounding the teaching of the law in public or secret gatherings. Soon afterward, Akiva himself was arrested. On the third day of the month of Tishri, according to the Hebrew calendar, he was imprisoned for conducting hidden lessons with his students. Earlier, a teacher named Pappos ben Judah had warned him to cease these meetings, arguing that spies were everywhere and that even secret gatherings were unsafe. Ironically, Pappos and Akiva later met inside the same prison. Pappos expressed sorrow that he was imprisoned for a minor worldly matter, while Akiva was held for a cause of far greater significance. The Roman governor, Tinius Rufus, treated Akiva with particular severity, recognizing him as a leading authority among the teachers. He kept him under strict imprisonment, preventing any access from outside. The remaining scholars, feeling the absence of Akiva deeply, continued to seek his guidance on legal and religious questions. In one instance, they even paid a large sum of money, 300 denarii, to a messenger in an attempt to reach him. Eventually, Akiva was brought forth for execution. Rufus subjected him to extreme torture. According to the account, his flesh was torn with iron instruments. Yet, during this suffering, Akiva continued to recite the declaration of faith known as the Shema, affirming the oneness of God. When asked by Rufus whether he was practicing some form of magic to endure the pain, Akiva responded that it was not magic, but joy in fulfilling the command to love God with his entire life. His final words emphasized the central declaration of Judaism, the unity of God. With Akiva's death, a profound loss was felt among the teachers of the law, who regarded him as a foundational authority of interpretation and wisdom. He left behind disciples and a son who continued his legacy and regarded his method of teaching as the guiding standard. Another prominent martyr was Chanina ben Teradion. Despite warnings from fellow scholars, including Jose ben Kisma, he continued to teach publicly until he was arrested. When questioned by Roman authorities about his actions, he declared that he was obeying a higher command. As punishment, he was wrapped in a scroll of the law and burned. His wife was also sentenced to death, and his daughter was condemned to humiliation, reflecting the widespread nature of the persecution. The deaths of Chuspit, who served as the interpreter for the Sanhedrin of Jamnia, and Isbab, its secretary, are recorded without detailed accounts, but both were likely executed for their involvement in teaching or preserving the law. Another martyr, Judah ben Bava, is described as the last among this group. Before his death, he attempted to ordain 7 students of Akiva, granting them authority to continue transmitting the tradition. He chose a remote valley between the cities of Usha and Shifamar for this act. Despite this attempt at secrecy, Roman forces discovered him. His students fled only after repeated urging, while he remained behind and accepted death without resistance, being pierced by spears. Because of fear of further punishment from Rufus, the usual public eulogy was not delivered at his funeral. The names and details of the remaining martyrs are not securely preserved. With this, the second generation of Tannoites came to an end. It was a generation marked by great intellectual achievement, profound leadership, and severe suffering. The defeat of the revolt led by Bar Kokhba became a decisive turning point in this period. In the aftermath, the site of the destroyed Jewish temple in Jerusalem was occupied by a structure dedicated to the Roman god Jupiter Capitolinus, a development interpreted by some Jewish Christian groups as a sign of approaching judgment and the eventual coming of a Redeemer. Roman authorities, including Emperor Hadrian and Governor Rufus, extended their harsh measures beyond the living to the dead. The bodies of those executed were left unburied, exposed as a warning to others not to resist Roman rule. This policy disregarded Jewish burial customs, which considered proper burial a sacred duty. For many observers, this treatment represented not only physical punishment, but also a deeper humiliation intended to break the spirit of the surviving population. In the aftermath of the devastating war and the crushing rule of Hadrian, when the land of Judea lay broken and its people scattered or subdued, there arose among the survivors a quiet but urgent sense of duty. A devout and thoughtful man, observing those who had submitted to Roman authority and now lived withdrawn from public life, sought to awaken in them a sacred responsibility. He wished to remind them that, even in defeat, there remained obligations that could not be abandoned. Chief among these was the burial of the dead. Those who had fallen and whose bodies had been left exposed denied the dignity of interment by the will of conquerors. To impress this duty upon them, he composed a work known as the Book of Tobit. In this writing, he placed strong emphasis on the act of secretly burying the bodies of those condemned to dishonor. He portrayed this task not merely as an act of compassion, but as a sacred obligation, one that might demand courage and sacrifice. At the same time, the narrative offered encouragement by suggesting that such dangerous devotion would not go unrewarded. The example given was that of Tobit himself, a righteous man who endured hardship and suffering as a consequence of his faithful actions, yet who ultimately received abundant blessings. The themes and circumstances reflected in this book point clearly to its origin during the reign of Hadrian, when such acts of quiet resistance carried real danger. The severity of Hadrian's persecution did not fall upon one group alone. It extended also to those known as Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus who had emerged from within the Jewish community but had begun to form distinct beliefs. Indeed, it may have affected all Christians alike, for the Roman authorities did not concern themselves with theological differences between Jews and Christians. To them, these distinctions were of no importance. The Christian writers, known as evangelists, later described the sufferings of this period in deeply troubling terms. They spoke of a time of desolation and terror, drawing upon earlier prophetic language from the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly from the prophet Daniel. They warned of a moment when those in Judea would be forced to flee, urging them to escape to the mountains. Their words expressed concern for the most vulnerable, pregnant women and infants, and advised prayer that such flight might not occur during the harsh conditions of winter or on the Sabbath, a day of rest in Jewish law. Faced with such dangers, both branches of the Christian movement, the Jewish Christians and those of non-Jewish origin, sought to distinguish themselves clearly from the Jewish people. Their aim was both political and religious, to avoid being included in the punishments directed against the Jews. Two prominent Christian teachers, Quadratus and Aristides, are said to have presented a formal petition to the Emperor Hadrian. In this appeal, they argued that Christianity was a separate faith, unconnected with Judaism. From this period onward, a decisive transformation took place. The Jewish Christians, who had previously observed many elements of Jewish law, gradually abandoned these practices. They adopted instead the theological doctrines that had developed among non-Jewish or Gentile Christians. As a visible sign of this change, they appointed, for the first time, a bishop who had not undergone circumcision, thereby demonstrating their departure from traditional Jewish identity. With this step, the final separation was completed. Jews and Christians no longer stood as opposing groups within a shared heritage, but as entirely distinct communities. Meanwhile, the condition of Judea itself remained dire. The land had been devastated, towns destroyed, fields laid waste, and populations either killed, executed, or driven into exile. Many wandered as refugees, seeking safety in distant regions more willing to receive them. Among those most deeply affected were the scholars and teachers of the law, particularly the disciples of Aquba, one of the greatest spiritual leaders of the time. These men, broken in spirit by the destruction, fled to regions such as Nisibis and Nehardea, cities located in Mesopotamia, within the broader territory of Babylonia. Had the persecution continued, it is likely that this eastern region would have become the central seat of Jewish life much earlier than it eventually did. Relief came only with the death of Emperor Hadrian, which occurred 3 years after the fall of Bedhar. To the Jewish people, his end was seen not merely as a natural event, but as an act of divine judgment. Like the earlier ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, Hadrian had come to symbolize oppression and suffering. His name was remembered with bitterness, often accompanied by a curse calling for his remains to be reduced to dust. Those who had survived now turned their hopes toward his successor, Antoninus Pius. Though he had been adopted by Hadrian, Antoninus Pius was known for a more humane and moderate disposition. It was believed that under his rule, conditions might improve. Encouragement came from an unexpected source, a noble Roman woman, residing either in Caesarea or Antioch, who was moved by compassion for the suffering of the Jewish people. She advised them to present a petition to the Roman authorities, requesting an end to the persecutions. This woman, possibly connected by marriage to a Roman official named Rufus, was said to have shown sympathy toward Judaism. Following her counsel, a group of Jewish representatives, led by Jehuda ben Shammua, approached the Roman governor. In their appeal, they expressed their anguish in deeply emotional terms, addressing the heavens as though speaking to a shared origin and asking why such suffering had been inflicted upon them. Their plea, filled with sorrow and humility, appears to have moved the governor, who in turn appealed to the emperor for a more lenient policy. Gradually, signs of relief began to appear. On the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Ab, corresponding roughly to August, news spread that the bodies of those who had fallen in battle could at last be buried. This permission carried immense significance, restoring a measure of dignity to the dead and comfort to the living. Further good news followed on the 28th day of the month of Adar, around March in the years 139 or 140 after the birth of Jesus Christ. On that day, it was announced that the harsh decrees imposed by Hadrian had been revoked. This date was thereafter preserved in the calendar as a moment of relief and restoration. Roman records confirm that Emperor Antoninus Pius granted the Jewish people the right to practice circumcision, a central rite of their faith. However, this permission was limited. They were not allowed to perform circumcision on non-Jews, thereby restricting the spread of their religion through conversion. In this way, while religious persecution came to an end, certain limitations remained. One prohibition, in particular, continued unchanged. The Jews were still forbidden to enter the city of Jerusalem, the heart of their former national and religious life. These 7 returning teachers were Meir, Judah ben Eli, Jose ben Calafta, Joachim of Alexandria, Simon ben Jokai, Eleazar ben Jacob, also known in some traditions as Eleazar ben Shammua, and Nehemiah. Each of them had been shaped by the teachings of Kokhba, whose interpretive methods had transformed legal study in earlier generations. Upon their return, they first assembled in the plain of Rimmon, a location remembered from the earlier revolutionary period. Their immediate concern was the regulation of the calendar, which had likely fallen into disorder during years of conflict and displacement. The Jewish calendar, dependent on both lunar observation and calculated adjustment, required periodic correction to maintain alignment with seasonal and religious cycles. At their first gathering, a severe dispute arose, likely connected to one of Kokhba's interpretive legal principles. However, despite the intensity of the disagreement, the matter was ultimately resolved in a spirit of reconciliation. After this initial assembly, they reconvened in Usha, a town in Galilee and the native place of Judah ben Eli. Usha had previously served briefly as a center of legal study, even before the revolt of Bar Kokhba. The returning teachers then issued invitations to other remaining scholars throughout Galilee, calling for a broader council. Many accepted the summons, and the residents of Usha provided support and accommodation for the gathered scholars. The purpose of this assembly was to restore the continuity of Jewish legal tradition, which had been severely disrupted by persecution and war. Over several days of deliberation, the council worked to re-establish teachings and customs that had been neglected or lost during the crisis period. At the conclusion of the meeting, formal addresses of gratitude were delivered. Judah ben Eli expressed appreciation to the visiting scholars who had traveled considerable distances, while other members of the assembly thanked the inhabitants of Usha for their hospitality and support. From this point, the community entered a stage of gradual reconstruction. Although the survival of the tradition had once appeared uncertain, the renewed activity of the scholars allowed legal and religious continuity to re-emerge, with structured teaching once again becoming the foundation of communal life. The scholars of this Tannaite circle, meaning the early legal transmitters of Jewish tradition, continued the work of earlier generations with significant personal sacrifice. Their task was to reconnect a disrupted chain of teaching that stretched back to earlier authorities. However, their numbers were smaller than before, and their intellectual influence, while still significant, did not match the scale of the previous generation. Among the most prominent figures of this period were Simon ben Gamaliel II, son of the former patriarch Gamaliel, Nathan of Babylon, Meir, and Simon ben Jokai. Simon ben Gamaliel II had survived earlier Roman violence, including the destruction associated with Bethar, through a series of unexpected escapes. In one account, a Roman official responsible for his detention, associated with the administration of Turnus Rufus, secretly warned him of impending danger, allowing him to flee and take refuge in Babylon. The details of his time in Babylon and the exact circumstances of his later assumption of leadership are not clearly preserved. Nevertheless, Simon ben Gamaliel II later sought to elevate the office of the patriarch, likely influenced by the structure of authority held by the Babylonian leader of the Jewish exile community. At the earliest assembly in Usha, Simon ben Gamaliel does not appear to have been present. He later established himself in Jabne, a location previously associated with his father's leadership, and remained there for a period, possibly managing inherited property. Meanwhile, the disciples of Kokhba, who had become central to legal interpretation, tended to remain in Usha, which gave them a sense of institutional independence from the patriarchal authority. Eventually, Simon ben Gamaliel joined the broader assembly in Galilee. Alongside him, Nathan and Meir played leading roles in discussion and instruction. Simon's approach to leadership was cautious in relation to earlier patterns. He avoided altering widely accepted traditional rulings and preferred to maintain established legal customs as transmitted from earlier authorities. In cases of uncertainty, he gave preference to inherited decisions rather than theoretical innovation. He also emphasized the stability of judicial authority. Even when a court reached an incorrect decision, he argued that its ruling should remain valid, in order to preserve respect for legal institutions. Without such stability, he believed public confidence in judicial authority would collapse. Simon ben Gamaliel summarized his vision of society in a principle stating that the world is sustained by three foundations: truth, justice, and peace. Among all the figures of this generation, Meir stands out as the most intellectually original. His analytical ability, intellectual discipline, and depth of reasoning were widely recognized and often compared to those of his teacher Kokhba. His original personal name is recorded in some traditions as Myaasa or Moise, a Greek form associated with Moses. Later legendary accounts suggest a possible descent from a converted Roman family, even linking him symbolically to Emperor Nero, though such claims remain unverified tradition rather than established history. Meir was born in Asia Minor, likely in the region of Cappadocia near the city of Caesarea. He earned his livelihood through the copying and transcription of sacred texts. His mastery of Hebrew orthography was so precise that he was able to reproduce entire texts, including the Book of Esther, from memory without error. Through this work, he earned a modest income, which he divided between supporting his household and assisting impoverished students. He married Beruria, also referred to as Valeria in some sources, the highly educated daughter of Chanina ben Terdian, a scholar whose legal expertise had been widely respected. Meir studied initially under Ishmael ben Elisha, but found his method of interpretation too restrained. He later adopted the more analytical approach developed by Kokhba, which shaped his intellectual framework and became central to his teaching style. Kokhba himself had recognized Meir's abilities and formally authorized him as a teacher, even granting him preference over Simon ben Gamaliel in scholarly standing, although Meir's youth initially limited his authority among senior scholars. Meir, one of the most influential teachers of the law in the generation following the great upheavals in Judea, was known for his sharp moral judgment and his refusal to evaluate a person merely by external status, such as age or appearance. He criticized the common tendency to judge worth by outward vessel rather than inner substance, expressing this idea in a vivid comparison. A new vessel may still contain aged and valuable wine, while an old vessel may hold nothing of worth at all. This teaching became one of his widely remembered sayings, emphasizing that true value lies in inner character and knowledge rather than external form. Alongside his legal and philosophical reasoning, Meir became known for his literary creativity, particularly in composing parables and allegorical stories. Tradition attributes to him the creation of hundreds of such fables centered on the figure of the fox, an animal frequently used in Eastern literature as a symbol of cunning and intelligence. Through these narratives, he communicated moral lessons in a form accessible to a wide audience. A deeply emotional tradition is preserved regarding Meir's personal life and his response to tragedy. It is related that while Meir was absent attending instruction at a school of the law, his two sons suddenly died on the Sabbath, the sacred day of rest in Jewish tradition. His wife, aware of his sensitivity, refrained from informing him during that holy day in order to spare him immediate grief. After the Sabbath had ended, she approached him with a question about whether something entrusted to a person must ultimately be returned to its owner. When Meir affirmed this principle, she led him to the place where their deceased children lay. Using his own words as a framework for acceptance, she explained that the children had been entrusted to their care and were now returned to their original giver. Meir accepted this interpretation with profound submission to divine judgment. This episode became emblematic of his humility and his belief in divine ownership of human life. Meir's character was also defined by deep modesty and restraint. He repeatedly emphasized that individuals should not focus excessively on material gain, but rather on the study of the law, and should maintain humility toward all human beings regardless of status. His contemporaries regarded him as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Rabbi Jose ben Halafta, addressing the inhabitants of Sepphoris, a major city in Galilee, described Meir as a man of deep piety, moral discipline, and spiritual greatness. His intellectual influence became so widely recognized that it was said metaphorically that anyone who touched Meir's staff would gain wisdom, indicating that association with him led to intellectual and moral elevation. One of Meir's distinctive characteristics was his willingness to learn from all types of people, including those who were socially or religiously controversial. He deliberately engaged in conversations with individuals who were viewed with suspicion by traditional circles in order to understand their perspectives. Among these was Elisha ben Abiah, known in later tradition by the name Aker, meaning the other one, a figure regarded as having departed from accepted religious belief. When Meir was criticized for maintaining contact with such a person, he responded with a metaphor. When encountering a ripe pomegranate, one consumes the fruit and discards the peel. In this way, he explained that valuable wisdom could be separated from flawed behavior. A well-known tradition describes Meir walking alongside Aker on a Sabbath journey. Aker was riding on horseback while Meir proceeded on foot, and they engaged in discussion about interpretations of sacred texts. At one point, Aker reminded Meir that he had reached the boundary permitted for travel on the Sabbath according to religious law and instructed him to turn back. Meir used this moment to urge Aker himself to reconsider his spiritual direction. Aker, however, expressed despair, believing that he had gone too far to return to a righteous path. He felt that divine mercy could no longer apply to him because of his past actions. In later accounts, during Acre's final illness, Meir again attempted to encourage repentance and spiritual return. Some traditions suggest that Meir believed he had succeeded in guiding him toward reconciliation before his death. Symbolic narratives describe Meir honoring his memory in a gesture of continued hope for redemption, expressing the belief that divine mercy might still extend beyond human judgment. Meir also maintained intellectual relationships with non-Jewish philosophers of his time. One such figure was Euonymus of Gadara, a Greek thinker associated with philosophical traditions common in the Roman Eastern provinces. In Jewish intellectual discourse, it was acknowledged that wisdom could be found among non-Jewish scholars as well, just as ancient figures such as Balaam were depicted as receiving knowledge from the divine despite their foreign origin. Meir visited Euonymus during personal mourning, offering consolation and recognizing that moral insight and engagement with the study of the law were not exclusively limited to the Jewish people in terms of intellectual value. Through these interactions, Meir appears to have become familiar with Stoic philosophy, a dominant intellectual system in the Roman world that emphasized reason, discipline, and moral virtue. He reinterpreted many of its ethical ideals through the framework of the Torah, asserting that the law of Moses was the ultimate path to moral perfection. According to his teaching, devotion to the law with pure intention elevates a person toward intellectual clarity, moral integrity, humility, patience, and spiritual closeness to God. He described the ideal scholar as one who is respected by others, free from resentment, capable of endurance, and elevated above ordinary concerns through disciplined study. In legal interpretation, Meir followed the analytical method of his teacher Rabbi Akiba, employing structured reasoning and logical argumentation in the study of religious law. He developed a highly dialectical approach in which legal decisions were examined through multiple opposing arguments. Because of this method, later students often found his rulings difficult to determine with certainty, as he would present both supporting and opposing reasoning for a single legal question. This approach, whether intended as serious legal analysis or intellectual demonstration, became an important stage in the development of Talmudic reasoning. Despite the complexity of his method, Meir's legal positions were often strict and precise. He argued, for example, that providing an insufficient marriage settlement to a wife could lead to easier dissolution of marriage and therefore should be avoided. He also maintained that even minor deviations in the laws of divorce could invalidate the entire process and affect the legal status of future children. In addition, he challenged the principle that legal rulings should be based solely on the most common cases in daily life, insisting instead that exceptional circumstances must also be taken into careful legal consideration. After the collapse of the Great Rebellion led by the Jewish commander known as Bar Kokhba, meaning son of the star, a figure regarded by his followers as a liberator against Roman rule, the surviving teachers of the Jewish tradition entered a new and difficult phase. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, ruling the vast Roman Empire from the year 117, had imposed harsh control over the province of Judea after the failed uprising. Roman officials and military governors enforced imperial decrees with severity, and the Jewish population was left divided, weakened, and reorganizing its religious life under pressure. Among the surviving teachers, called Tanaim, meaning transmitters of oral tradition, most adopted a position that placed the preservation of religious knowledge above all other concerns. They concluded that even if life itself was threatened, the continuation of teaching and transmitting the law of Moses, understood as both the written Pentateuch and the oral traditions of interpretation, must not cease. In a gathering held in an upper chamber in the city of Lydda, a center of rabbinic discussion in Judea, a formal decision was made that the act of teaching the law carried greater importance than strict ritual observance under persecution. At the same time, the Roman authorities and their local collaborators intensified surveillance. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most influential interpreters of Jewish law, continued to teach in secrecy despite warnings from contemporaries such as Pappos, son of Judah, who urged him to abandon public instruction due to the presence of informers. Akiva rejected withdrawal, maintaining that the survival of the law required continued transmission. He was arrested on the third day of the month of Tishrei in the Hebrew calendar, which corresponds to early autumn. He was imprisoned under the Roman governor who is referred to in sources as Rufus, likely Quintus Tinius Rufus, who treated him as a central figure of resistance. In prison, Akiva continued to be regarded as the intellectual leader of the legal tradition. His students attempted to seek his rulings even under heavy restriction, once sending a messenger who paid a large sum, described as 300 silver coins, in order to reach him. Eventually, he was executed by Roman torture, including the removal of skin using iron instruments. During his execution, he recited the Shema, the declaration of divine unity central to Jewish belief, and his final words affirmed the unity of God. His death was considered a catastrophic loss to the transmission of legal wisdom. Another major figure executed was Chaninus, son of Teradion, who continued public teaching despite imperial prohibition. When questioned before Roman authority, he declared that his actions were commanded by divine law. He was executed by burning while wrapped in a scroll of the law. His wife and daughter were also punished under Roman orders. Other executions included Chutspit, the interpreter of the Assembly of Jamnia, and Isbab, a secretary of the same rabbinic court. Judah, son of Baba, another teacher, was executed after secretly ordaining remaining disciples of Akiva in a remote valley between Usha and Shepharim, two centers of rabbinic activity in Galilee. He was killed by Roman spears when discovered, and the continuity of rabbinic authority was preserved only through his final act. This period marked the end of the second generation of Tannaim, the rabbinic sages responsible for preserving oral tradition after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. The suppression of the rebellion and the establishment of a Roman sanctuary to Jupiter on the former site of the Jerusalem Temple symbolized the depth of the transformation. Jewish tradition interpreted these events as a profound rupture in national and religious life. Under Roman administration, even burial of the dead was restricted. Bodies of those killed in conflict were left unburied as a warning against further resistance. This policy caused distress among the population, as Jewish law placed great importance on respectful burial. Roman officials, including Emperor Hadrian and Governor Rufus, enforced these measures as part of deterrence policy. Within the surviving rabbinic circles, new intellectual figures emerged to continue the development of legal interpretation. Rabbi Meir developed systematic methods of organizing the oral traditions known as halashot, meaning legal rulings. These teachings had previously been transmitted in unstructured form, memorized and repeated without written codification. Meir grouped them into thematic categories, such as laws concerning Sabbath observance, marriage, and property disputes. These structured compilations were later referred to as Mishnah, meaning repeated teaching. One of Meir's students, Symmachus, son of Joseph, developed analytical methods to an extreme degree, focusing on theoretical argumentation rather than practical legal decisions. Because of this approach, he was later excluded from rabbinic circles. Another major contemporary was Simon, son of Yohei, a Galilean sage known for strict opposition to Roman authority. He was forced into hiding after criticizing Roman governance and lived in concealment for a period. His legal reasoning relied on direct interpretation of biblical text and logical deduction, avoiding symbolic or mystical expansion. He introduced interpretive rules that extended legal application from specific cases to broader categories, such as expanding dietary or marital restrictions from limited groups to entire classes of populations. Judah, son of Ælia, based in Usha, represented a more moderate approach. He supported coexistence with Roman authority while maintaining loyalty to Jewish law. He also emphasized the value of manual labor alongside religious study, teaching that productive work was an honorable duty. Jose, son of Halafta of Sepphoris, contributed to historical scholarship. He compiled a chronological work known as the Order of the World, tracing history from creation narratives through biblical periods and extending toward the era of Alexander the Great. His work attempted to systematize historical time within the framework of scriptural tradition, reconciling textual inconsistencies and organizing events into a coherent timeline. Another influential figure was Judah's son of Eli's, contemporary Judah of Usha, known for diplomatic skill and moderation. He was recognized for his ability to mediate between Roman administrative realities and Jewish legal requirements, and he worked as a laborer, teaching that dignity is preserved through honest occupation. Together, these teachers formed the intellectual foundation of post-rebellion Judaism, continuing the transmission of law, interpretation, and historical memory under conditions of political suppression and cultural transformation. Among the lesser-known circles of the second generation of the disciples of Kokhba, the great teacher whose martyrdom had marked a turning point in Jewish history, there were groups whose activities were only faintly preserved in later tradition. Beyond the scholars of Galilee, there existed another group in the southern region of Judea, known in Hebrew as the Southern District or Darum. This southern school continued the method of teaching associated with Ishmael ben Elisha, emphasizing a different interpretive approach to the law. From this southern circle, only two figures are clearly remembered in surviving records: Josiah and Jonathan, whose names remain as the last trace of that scholarly tradition. In addition to these regional schools, a figure of particular interest emerged from Babylonia, named Nathan, a member of the family of the Prince of the Exile, the ruling house that governed the Jewish community in Babylon under Persian and later Parthian influence. This Nathan was a Babylonian by birth and of distinguished lineage. Yet the sources do not clearly explain where he acquired his knowledge of the halakhic traditions, nor what led him to leave Babylonia and take up residence in Judea. His departure is especially striking, since Babylonia offered him a position of greater stability and status than the uncertain conditions of the Roman-controlled province of Judea. During this period, several teachers of the law operated in different regions outside the main centers of Galilee and Judea. Among them was Judah ben Bethura, who taught in the city of Nisibis, located in Mesopotamia. He is believed to have provided refuge for fugitives who had escaped from Judea after the destruction and persecutions. Another important figure was Shenaniah, the nephew of Joshua ben Hananiah, one of the leading sages in Judea. Shenaniah had been sent by his uncle to the Babylonian region of Nahar-Pekod, a settlement near Nahardia, with the intention of removing him from the influence of emerging Jewish Christian groups. A third significant transmitter of Jewish legal tradition was Matthias ben Charash, who lived in Rome and is credited with bringing the study of Jewish law from the eastern regions of Asia into the western world of Europe. While the scholars in Galilee were engaged in rebuilding Jewish intellectual life, working to reestablish the authority of the Great Sanhedrin, the central religious and legal court, and to preserve tradition through careful collection and organization of teachings, there was a growing danger of division. A deep schism threatened to split the Babylonian Jewish community away from the central authority in Judea. This danger was averted largely through the diplomatic wisdom of Simon ben Gamaliel II, the leading patriarch of the time. In Babylonia, Shenaniah had already established a separate council resembling a Sanhedrin in Nahar-Pekod, likely near Nahardia. He presided over this body, and a leader named Nechunya, possibly connected with the ruling house of the exile, appears to have supported him. The Babylonian Jewish community, which had long been dependent on the authority of Judea but was left isolated after the destruction of its central institutions, welcomed this new Sanhedrin with enthusiasm and accepted its rulings as binding. Shenaniah even went so far as to regulate the calendar independently, introducing leap years and determining festival observances according to the earlier practice of Judea. However, once a restored Sanhedrin was re-established in Usha in the land of Judea, it became impossible to allow a rival authority to continue functioning. Such a development threatened to divide Judaism into two separate centers, one in the east and one in the west. To prevent this outcome, the Patriarch Simon sent two emissaries, Isaac and Nathan, to Babylonia. Their mission was diplomatic and carefully framed, carrying conciliatory messages and unusually respectful wording, addressing Shenania as His Holiness Shenania. The Babylonian leader, unprepared for such courtesy, received the envoys warmly and introduced them before his assembly with honor. Once trust had been established, the envoys revealed the true purpose of their mission. During public readings, subtle but deliberate alterations were introduced into the interpretation of sacred texts. One reading replaced the divine designation of festival days with a reference to Shenania himself. Another prophetic passage was reinterpreted to suggest that religious authority would come not from Zion and Jerusalem, but from Babylon and Nahar-Pekod. These symbolic alterations made clear the danger of establishing an independent religious authority outside Judea. The audience understood the implication. Such a development contradicted the unity of the law and risked creating a second center of authority. Shenania attempted to defend his position by accusing the envoys of manipulation, but they responded that establishing a rival Sanhedrin in Babylon was equivalent to erecting an unauthorized altar and appointing unlawful priests, thereby breaking the unity of the worship of the God of Israel. Shenania argued that the authority of the Judean Sanhedrin itself had weakened after the destruction of the temple. The envoys replied that those he considered insignificant had grown into capable leaders, reaffirming the continuity of authority in Judea. Eventually, Shenania found support only from Judah ben Bethura, who reminded him that in sacred matters absolute submission to the central authority of Judea was required. With no broader support, Shenania withdrew his independent regulations, and the Babylonian Sanhedrin dissolved, restoring unity under the Judean leadership. In Judea itself, however, tensions arose within the Sanhedrin at Usha. Internal disputes threatened to resemble earlier conflicts, such as the famous disagreement between Gamaliel and Joshua in an earlier generation. Simon ben Gamaliel II, seeking to strengthen the dignity of his office as patriarch, introduced new ceremonial distinctions to emphasize hierarchical order. Previously, all officials were treated with a certain equality in public assemblies, rising together when leaders entered. The patriarch now changed this custom so that only he would receive full public honors. His deputy, the Abeth Din, would receive reduced recognition, and the scholarly speaker, known as the Chacham, would receive even less formal respect. When Nathan and Meir attended a session and observed these changes, they became dissatisfied and secretly began planning opposition. Their aim was to challenge Simon's authority by demonstrating his lack of complete mastery of legal tradition. They intended to question him publicly on difficult points of law, expose his weaknesses before the assembly, and then propose his removal as patriarch. Their plan included elevating Nathan, as a descendant of the house of David and connected to the prince of the exile, to the position of patriarch, while Meir would serve as his deputy. However, before the conspiracy could be carried out, the plan was discovered, and Simon was warned in advance, allowing him to prepare for the confrontation that was about to unfold. The patriarch Simon ben Gamaliel, upon discovering a political and administrative scheme directed against his authority, succeeded in having two influential figures removed from membership in the Sanhedrin, the central legal and religious council of Jewish tradition in that period. However, their exclusion did not weaken their influence. Instead, they continued to exert pressure from outside the assembly by composing complex legal questions and distributing them among the remaining scholars. This created confusion and embarrassment within the council, as the members were forced to respond without the intellectual guidance of those who had been expelled. Referring to this situation, Jose ben Kalafta, one of the leading scholars of the generation, later remarked, "We are seated within the house of a law, but the law itself is outside," indicating that the excluded scholars still held intellectual dominance over the discussions. Eventually, the two expelled figures were formally readmitted into the assembly. However, Simon ben Gamaliel ensured that their names would not be included in the official records of legal ordinances issued under his leadership. This administrative decision reflected ongoing tension between authority and intellectual independence within the council. One of the figures, Rabbi Nathan of Babylon, later reached reconciliation with the patriarch. However, the conflict between Simon ben Gamaliel and Meir remained unresolved. Simon ultimately proceeded to excommunicate Meir from the community. He challenged the authority of the ruling by invoking a previous resolution of the Sanhedrin established at Usha, which had stated that no member could be excommunicated without clear justification. Meir demanded formal proof of the grounds, authority, and legal basis for the sentence, thereby questioning the legitimacy of the decision itself. In a final expression attributed to him, Meir is reported to have declared on his deathbed, "Tell the sons of the Holy Land that their Messiah has died in a foreign land." According to his final wishes, his burial took place on the seashore, away from the traditional centers of burial within Judea. During the same period, the Patriarchate of Simon ben Gamaliel was marked by continuous pressure from Roman administrative authorities. Following the failed revolt of Bar Kokhba and the earlier persecutions under Hadrian, relations between the Roman governing system and the Jewish population remained deeply hostile. The victorious Roman authorities maintained strict control over the population, and acts of oppression and punishment were frequent. Simon ben Gamaliel himself recorded that earlier generations had only anticipated hardship from a distance, while his own generation experienced continuous suffering over extended periods of time. He described a condition in which even a written record of all persecutions and temporary reliefs would be insufficient to contain the full extent of the events. Tensions between Roman authorities and Jewish communities eventually contributed to another uprising in Judea during the final year of the reign of the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius, in the year 161 of the Common Era. However, the origins, location, and full outcome of this revolt are not clearly preserved in historical records. This uprising appears to have been influenced by wider geopolitical movements, particularly the military preparations of the Parthian Empire against Rome. The Jewish population, despite earlier disappointments, again associated Parthian expansion with the possibility of liberation from Roman rule. Simon ben Jokai, a leading scholar of the period, expressed skepticism toward Roman authority and made a symbolic remark that when a Parthian horse would be tied near the grave of an Israelite, only then could one speak of the arrival of the Messiah, reflecting both political tension and religious expectation. The revolt, however, was poorly organized and was suppressed quickly by the Roman governor of Syria before any Parthian intervention could take place. Shortly afterward, a broader Parthian war broke out between the years 161 and 165 of the Common Era, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a philosopher known for Stoic thought, and his co-ruler Lucius Verus Commodus, who delegated military command to experienced generals while remaining distant from active warfare. During the early phase of this conflict, Parthian forces under King Vologases invaded Roman territory in Syria, defeated the Roman governor Avidius Cornelius, and caused significant disruption across the region. In response, the Roman Empire sent additional military forces under Lucius Verus to the eastern provinces, while actual military command was conducted by Roman generals. Lucius Verus himself remained in cities such as Antioch, Laodicea, and Daphne, where he engaged in court life rather than military operations. In parallel with these military events, new measures were introduced in Judea affecting Jewish legal autonomy. Under Emperor Lucius Verus, Jewish judicial authority was either restricted or removed entirely, although historical sources differ on whether this involved the abolition of courts or the removal of judges from office. Simon ben Jokai is recorded as having expressed relief at the loss of judicial responsibility, stating that he did not feel personally suited to such administrative duties. Despite the fact that the leading members of the Sanhedrin had not participated in rebellion, Roman authorities appear to have continued to suspect them of political involvement. A recorded discussion among the scholars Judah ben Eli, Jose ben Calafta, and Simon ben Jokai at Usha reflects the ideological divisions of the time regarding Roman rule. Judah ben Eli spoke in a conciliatory manner, emphasizing the practical contributions of Roman governance, including the construction of cities, markets, bridges, and public baths. José ben Calafta remained neutral and refrained from comment. Simon ben Jokai, however, expressed strong opposition, arguing that Roman infrastructure served primarily economic and self-interested purposes and criticized the moral character of Roman urban institutions. A proselyte who overheard the exchange later repeated Simon's remarks, leading to severe consequences. Judah ben Ali received honors from Roman authorities, José ben Calafta was exiled to Laodicea, and Simon ben Jokai was sentenced to death. As a result of these events, the Sanhedrin at Usha effectively ceased functioning as a stable governing body, since its leading figures have been removed, exiled, or placed under surveillance by Roman authorities. Simon ben Jokai himself escaped execution by taking refuge in a cave, where he remained in isolation for an extended period. During this time, he survived on minimal sustenance and lived under conditions of extreme deprivation. According to tradition, after years in hiding, he emerged following a perceived change in political conditions, possibly connected to the death of Lucius Verus around the year 169. Following his emergence, he is described as having restored his health in the thermal springs of Tiberias. In recognition of his recovery, he declared the city of Tiberias legally pure for habitation, overturning previous concerns related to burial sites in the area. This decision was contested by scholars from Magdala, also known as Tarakia, who viewed it as a controversial and unauthorized alteration of established tradition, thereby continuing the intellectual and legal disputes that characterized the period.